Did you know that during the time of the Roman Empire, there were no tampons, sanitary pads, or even underwear? Yet somehow Roman women managed to deal with their monthly cycles. What did they use? This is one of the many questions we can answer thanks to archaeology. It's me, and this is my channel. Today we are going to be exploring what archaeologists have uncovered about how women in ancient Rome dealt with their periods. From sponges on sticks to duckbills, there was nothing in the Roman arsenal that would make a 21st century woman blush. Though the specifics of how women managed their cycles varied throughout ancient history, we can get some general ideas from what little pieces of evidence we have. For example, that women likely had access to safe and effective birth control methods long before it became available in the modern day. But let's start at the beginning. The earliest evidence for menstruation comes from our distant ancestors. 15,000 years ago, a girl who lived near what is now Lake Turkana, in Kenya, had a small piece of cloth tucked into her loincloth. This 8-inch by 4-inch swatch of material was not only used to catch her period, but was also used to collect menstrual blood for ritualistic purposes. Researchers believe this because other similar cloths were found nearby that had been used for ritualistic bleeding during childbirth. The fact that both pieces of cloth were stored in a cave may suggest that they were considered sacred. She would have fashioned these makeshift pads from reeds or grasses that grew nearby, which is a strategy that women all over the world have relied on throughout history. But while these early humans had access to natural materials for making pads, women living in warmer climates like ancient Egypt would have been better off using something else. Given that linen would easily become reabsorbed and smelly, Egyptian women likely used papyrus plants instead. Archaeologists found evidence that women were using these plants as early as 3000 BC. They crafted them into long, narrow strips and inserted them into their vaginas. However, it seems that these women didn't use these strips during their regular cycles. Instead, they used them during sex as a form of contraception. It's possible that the narrow strips acted as a diaphragm, blocking sperm from reaching the egg. Though they weren't foolproof, and women still got pregnant anyway, so they may have also functioned as a spermicidal jelly. The strips probably got pretty gross after a few days, so they may have just been used once and then tossed. Ancient Greek women would adopt a similar practice. They inserted strips of linen or wool into their vaginas before sex to prevent pregnancy. And if they got pregnant anyway, they would use a similar strategy to induce an abortion. While the Greeks believed that the vagina was full of holes leading directly to deadly and dangerous internal organs, the Romans had a more accurate idea of female anatomy. Roman philosopher and natural scientist Pliny the Elder described the female reproductive system in detail, including the uterus. Even so, women still did not have access to safe abortions, so they likely continued to rely on herbal remedies to stop unwanted pregnancies. These remedies included extracts made from things like rue and silphium. When it came to dealing with menstruation, however, the Romans had a plethora of options. Roman women of lower classes would likely rely on inexpensive and accessible materials like papyrus plants, or perhaps even moss. But women who could afford it would have a variety of luxurious options. Wealthy women may have used linen or cotton, either in strip or pad form, though these would need to be washed and dried frequently. Because of their higher status, wealthy women had servants who could help manage this process. Other wealthier women preferred to use sponges on sticks. Archaeologists found a number of these kits in the ruins of Pompeii, where the wax coating had preserved on the wooden stick. The sponges would have been attached to the end and inserted into the vagina. This strategy was convenient because the women could leave them inside for multiple days without needing to change them. Then they could rinse the sponge off and use it again. Women may have even used them while bathing, but that wasn't the only way Roman women dealt with their cycles. Some scholars theorize that Roman women may have used a type of diaphragm similar to the ones used today. In fact, the goddess Diana was often depicted in artwork with a diaphragm-like object in her hand. While there is no direct evidence that women were using diaphragms to catch their periods, the objects found with Diana could have been used for that purpose. Or maybe she was just holding a toothbrush. There's also evidence that women may have tried to suck the blood out of their bodies. Archaeological evidence for this comes from women's toilets, which sometimes had marks left in the clay by sucking blood out of the vagina. However, scholars debate whether these marks were made during menstruation or for another purpose, such as treating hemorrhoids. Other toilets had built-in holes for inserting a tube or a sponge on a stick. This suggests that these toilets were used for douching. Unfortunately, the only written instructions for douching come from a doctor named Cyrannus, who believed that women should douche daily to stay healthy. He thought that a woman's vagina was full of foul-smelling, disease-ridden holes, and that was not a good thing. Scholars think that his advice was extreme and that daily douching was unnecessary. In fact, he may have just been trying to scare women into visiting him for medical treatment. And speaking of doctors, there was one Roman doctor who seemed pretty enlightened when it came to women's health. While most Roman physicians believed that the ovaries were a part of the kidneys, Aesculapius believed that they were a part of the reproductive system. In fact, he believed that the ovaries produced eggs that traveled down fallopian tubes. Unfortunately, he died before he could prove his theories, and they weren't accepted until centuries later. What do these practices tell us about everyday life in ancient Rome? First of all, it tells us that menstruation was a fact of life and nothing to be ashamed of. If anything, it was just another thing that women had to deal with. Not much different than a yeast infection or ingrown hairs, except that they happened every month and lasted anywhere from 2 to 7 days. The variety of period products also tells us about the resources available to women and their social class. It's pretty unlikely that a poor farmer's daughter would have the same products available to her as a wealthy merchant's daughter, especially given that merchants' daughters were educated at home and had more access to nice fabrics. It also tells us that women of all social classes needed a variety of tools to deal with their periods. There was no one-size-fits-all solution. As far as what women did with their used period products, the evidence is pretty slim. However, we do know that the urine was saved and used for cleaning purposes, so it's likely that women either boiled their rags or threw them in the Tiber River. After all, public bathrooms weren't exactly equipped with proper waste disposal systems. Some scholars even hypothesize that prostitutes would have traded their used rags for money. However, there is no direct evidence to support this theory. One of the biggest surprises about Roman attitudes towards menstruation comes from a woman named Cornelia Metella. She died in 1918 BC and was buried with a stone slab which contained an inscription detailing her life. She had been born into an elite family and married the local magistrate. But the inscription doesn't just tell us about her happy marriage. It also tells us that she suffered from terrible cramps and painful breasts. It's one of the few pieces of evidence that gives us insight into how painful menstruation could be. It also tells us that despite suffering through debilitating pain every month, she went on to have 4 children. Overall, there's a lot that archaeology can tell us about how women handled their periods in ancient Rome, but there is still a great deal that we don't know. Hopefully, future discoveries will shed light on this aspect of ancient life. What about you? Did you learn anything new in this video? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.